Title: The Midnight Diner. Chapter 1: The Last Ride. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale silver light across the deserted road. Ava, Jack and Laura sat in the car, the engine humming steadily, cutting through the oppressive silence that had settled over the land. The journey had been long, the hours passing unnoticed, as the endless stretch of asphalt seemed to extend without end. It was as if time had been swallowed by the thick blanket of darkness that enveloped them, a darkness so dense it felt almost tangible. Ava glanced at the dashboard, where the small clock blinked 2:17 a.m., and then back to the road. Nothing but the occasional flicker of distant lights on the horizon. The world outside seemed both eerily quiet and suffocatingly vast. It felt as if they were driving into a space that didn't belong to time or reality, a place suspended between what was and what might never be. She turned to Jack, who was hunched over the steering wheel, his hands gripping it too tightly, his knuckles white. He hadn't said much for the past few hours, his silence pulling at her like a knot tightening in her chest. "You okay?" she asked softly, though the question felt almost unnecessary. She knew he wasn't. None of them were. Jack didn't respond immediately. He just stared out the windshield, the faintest tremor in his jaw. Eva could see it now. The unease that had taken root in him. An unease that had crept into all of them since they left the city. "I'm fine," Jack finally muttered, but the words were hollow, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. His voice was strained, the exhaustion creeping into his tone. Just tired, I guess." Laura, sitting in the passenger seat beside him, flicked on the radio, hoping to break the heavy silence. The static buzzed in response, and then, after a few moments, a low, haunting tune filtered through the speakers. It was a song neither of them recognized, an old ballad with a slow, mournful beat. "Not your usual playlist, huh?" Eva joked weakly, but her voice faltered as the eerie melody seemed to wrap itself around her, pulling at something deep inside her. She hadn't noticed it earlier, but now it seemed too deliberate, too unnatural. Laura glanced at the radio dial, frowning. "It's weird. I swear I didn't change the station." A cold chill crept down Eva's spine. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, rubbing her arms as if to ward off the creeping sense of dread that was steadily making its presence felt. "I think we should stop soon," she said, trying to sound casual, though the words felt foreign coming out of her mouth. "Take a break, maybe grab a drink or something." Jack nodded absently, but didn't make any move to slow the car. He was too focused, too lost in his own thoughts, to notice the tension building around them. The road stretched out before them like an endless ribbon of grey, the occasional flicker of lights in the distance the only sign that they weren't completely alone in this vast, oppressive expanse. The air outside was still and suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for them. They had been driving for hours without seeing another car, no other headlights, no distant tail lights, just the three of them, alone in the dark. It was almost as if the world had forgotten they were there. As they drove deeper into the night, the fog began to roll in. At first, it was just a thin mist, barely visible, like a whisper curling around the edges of their vision. But it thickened quickly, clinging to the road and wrapping around the car like a cold, unseen hand. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel, and Laura's knuckles went pale as she clutched her seat. Eva felt a strange, uncomfortable pull in her chest, as if the air itself was heavy with something wrong. "Do you see that?" Laura asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might disturb whatever was lurking in the fog. Ava squinted through the windshield, straining to see. A faint glow appeared ahead, just a dot at first, flickering like a candle in the dark. Then it grew larger, clearer, until they could make out the outline of a sign. "The Midnight Diner," Eva read aloud, her voice thick with disbelief. "What kind of name is that?" "Not one I want to find out about, that's for sure," Jack muttered. But even as he spoke, his hands were already moving to turn the wheel, guiding them toward the neon glow. As they approached, the diner seemed to materialize out of the fog like a phantom. It was an old building, its wooden structure creaking under the weight of time. The sign, though flickering, was the only thing that illuminated the surrounding gloom. The windows were dark, save for a single light above the door. It was a strange, unsettling sight, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. The car slowed as they pulled into the gravel parking lot. The headlights cut through the fog, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The diner seemed even more isolated in the thick mist, its appearance both strange and familiar, as though it had been waiting for them, waiting for something. "Doesn't seem like anyone else is here," Eva said, her voice uneasy as she looked out the window. The lot was empty, except for a single car parked by the door, its headlights turned off. Jack pulled into a spot and turned off the engine. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft hum of the wind and the sound of their own breath. "Maybe they're open all night," Laura suggested, though even she didn't sound convinced. "Could be the only place for miles." Jack's eyes darted to the fog-shrouded road ahead. There was nowhere else to go, and the eerie stillness of the night had begun to wear on him. "All right," he said, finally breaking the silence. "Let's just get out of here. I'm not driving another hour in this fog." Eva hesitated, glancing at the diner one last time. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But then Jack opened the door, and she couldn't bring herself to voice her concerns. Slowly, she followed him outside, her shoes crunching against the gravel as she stepped into the thick, moist air. The door to the diner creaked open as they approached, the sound hanging in the air like a warning. As they stepped inside, a bell above the door jingled softly. The diner was empty, save for a lone figure sitting in the corner booth, his back to them. A waitress, a woman with raven black hair and a pale, almost translucent complexion, appeared from behind the counter. She smiled at them with a strange, knowing look in her eyes. "Welcome to the Midnight Diner," she said, her voice low and inviting. "What can I get for you this late?" The trio stood frozen for a moment, as the woman's eyes seemed to linger on them too long. Just a beat too long. Eva couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something far beyond just being lost on an empty road at night. Still, Jack led the way to an empty booth by the window. As they slid into their seats, the mist outside seemed to press against the glass like unseen hands trying to push inside. The diner was quiet, too quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the waitress brought over their drinks, her eyes met Eva's for just a moment longer than necessary. There was something in her gaze, something Eva couldn't place, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps something darker. "Enjoy your meal," the waitress said, her voice carrying an eerie calm that unsettled Eva to her core. And then, just as quickly as they had arrived, the diner seemed to envelop them entirely. The night had begun. Chapter 2. The Midnight Diner. The bell above the door jingled again as they settled into their booth, the sound strangely hollow, as though it had no place in this forgotten corner of the world. Outside, the fog pressed in tighter, the air thick with dampness, and the smell of something old, almost decayed, lingered in the stagnant air. The diner, despite its somewhat eerie charm, offered a strange sense of comfort, a small island of warmth and light in the oppressive dark. Jack, Laura, and Eva sat in silence, the weight of the stillness pressing on their chests. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was almost deafening in the quiet, their harsh, flickering glow throwing long shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. It felt as if the world had gone on without them, leaving them in this liminal space, cut off from the rest of time. "I don't know," Laura said, her voice low and strained, breaking the silence. "Something feels off. It's like we're not supposed to be here." Eva nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the room again, trying to shake the sensation crawling along her spine. The waitress, who had brought them their drinks, was now standing at the counter, watching them intently. Her pale eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, as though they were absorbing everything they saw, and her lips curled into a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Eva glanced at Jack, but he didn't seem to notice the tension building in the air. His gaze was fixed on the menu, his fingers tracing the edges absent-mindedly. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, not looking up. "It's just a diner. We're all tired. Let's just eat, then head back on the road. But Ava couldn't shake it. The air felt thick, oppressive, almost like the room was closing in on them. She looked at Laura, whose face was drawn, her eyes darting nervously between the waitress and the shadowy corners of the diner. Laura was trying to hide it, but Eva could see the fear creeping in. "You're right," Eva whispered, her voice tight. "It's like we don't belong here." Just then, the waitress approached their table again, her feet silent on the worn tile as she moved with an unnatural grace. She placed a worn, leather-bound menu in front of them, her fingers lingering just a moment too long. "Are you ready to order?" she asked, her voice smooth and inviting. But there was something unsettling in the cadence of her words, something that made Eva's skin prickle. Jack looked up, his eyes distant. "Yeah," he said distractedly. "I'll have the steak, medium rare." "And you?" the waitress asked, turning her gaze to Laura, her smile tightening into something more predatory. "I'll just have the soup," Laura said quickly, almost too quickly, her hands twisting in her lap as if she were trying to hide some unspoken anxiety. Eva hesitated, her mind racing. She had never been one to trust her instincts blindly, but tonight felt different. The whole diner seemed to pulse with an energy that was foreign, dark. She tried to push the feeling aside, but it was persistent, relentless. "I'll have the same," she said, almost mechanically. The words came out like they were someone else's. The waitress gave a slight nod, though her lips seemed to curl just a little bit more at the edges. She turned, walking away with the same unnervingly fluid motion, her presence leaving behind an echo in the air. As she moved toward the kitchen, Eva noticed how her shadow stretched unnaturally long across the floor, as though it was no longer in sync with the rest of her. A thick silence fell over them again, the kind that settled deep into the bones. Even the soft hum of the diner's refrigerator seemed to have stilled. Eva didn't know why, but she felt as though something had shifted in that moment. The atmosphere was different now, charged, heavy, as if the very walls were holding their breath. "Are you sure we should stay here?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. She cast a furtive glance toward the lone man in the corner booth, who hadn't moved since they arrived. He sat with his back to them, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his head slightly tilted as though he were listening for something just out of reach. "I don't know," Ava replied, her throat tight. "But something's wrong. I can't explain it." Jack, however, was growing more irritated by the second. "You two are freaking out over nothing," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's just a diner. Let's just eat and go. You're overthinking it." But his voice lacked conviction. His words were hollow, as if he too felt the strange dissonance that vibrated in the very air around them. The minutes stretched on like hours, the weight of the stillness pressing in on them from all sides. Jack fidgeted with his napkin, twisting it in his fingers, while Laura's eyes flitted nervously from one corner of the room to the next, never staying in one place for too long. Eva couldn't bring herself to look at the waitress, though she knew she was watching them. Her presence was suffocating, and every time Eva's eyes lingered too long on her, her stomach twisted in revulsion. Finally, the waitress returned, a silent phantom, setting down 3 bowls of steaming soup in front of them. The scent was heavy, rich, almost too rich, but it was the color that struck Eva first, an unsettling shade of red, like blood left to congeal in the dark. The steam rose from the bowls, thick and cloying, like it was alive. "You'll find it's to your liking," the waitress said, her voice smooth, a little too smooth, and once again, her smile never quite reached her eyes. Jack picked up his spoon, the noise of the metal scraping against the bowl sharp in the silence. He dipped it into the soup without a second thought, taking a bite. The room seemed to hold its breath as he chewed, his eyes narrowing slightly. This isn't bad," he said slowly, though something in his tone made it sound less like a compliment and more like a forced response. Laura hesitated, looking at the soup, then back at Eva. There was an unspoken tension between them, a silent agreement that this wasn't normal. I'm not hungry," Laura said, pushing the bowl away slightly, though her eyes remained fixed on it, as if she couldn't tear her gaze away from the bubbling crimson liquid. Eva tried not to think about it. She picked up her spoon, dipped it into the soup, and brought it to her lips. The taste hit her immediately, sharp, metallic, and thick, like something foul and ancient. She gasped, almost choking on the thick liquid as it slid down her throat, the flavor lingering sickly sweet in a way that made her stomach churn. "God!" she whispered, her hand shaking as she put the spoon down. "What is this?" Jack didn't look up. His eyes were glazed over, lost in thought, though his mouth moved as he chewed the soup slowly. "It's fine," he said, his words dull. "You're just overthinking it, Eva." But his voice was growing quieter, slower. Eva felt a tremor run through her body, a creeping sensation of dread that twisted in her gut. She looked around the diner, eyes darting from corner to corner, as though the walls themselves were watching her. There was something wrong that went beyond the soup, beyond the strange waitress, beyond the emptiness of the diner. It was as if the very building had a life of its own, breathing with them, watching, waiting. And then she saw it. The man in the corner booth. His head had tilted further, his body slumped slightly, but his hands remained locked in place on the table, unmoving. Eva froze, her breath caught in her chest. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and in that moment, she realized what had been bothering her all along. The man wasn't just sitting there, he was waiting, and they were about to be his next guests. Chapter 3. Whispers in the dark. The man in the corner booth had not moved, yet there was something almost palpable in the way his stillness stretched through the diner like an unseen force. His presence felt like a weight on the room, a shadow that clung to every corner. Eva couldn't take her eyes off him. The more she stared, the more the air around her seemed to constrict, as if the very walls of the diner were closing in on them, squeezing the life from her. Laura shifted uneasily in her seat, her eyes darting between the man and the door as if she were trying to find an escape route. She whispered, her voice trembling, "Do you think we should leave this place? It's not right." Eva wanted to say something, anything to reassure her, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. The soup had tasted wrong. It had felt wrong, unnatural, like it had come from a place far darker than any kitchen should ever reach. And the man, he wasn't just sitting there. He was staring at them, but not in a way that a normal person would. His gaze felt invasive, like he was seeing into their very souls, picking apart their deepest fears. Jack didn't notice, or maybe he simply didn't care. He was still eating, though the motions had grown slow and mechanical. His eyes were half-lidded, glazed over, as though he were in a trance. His lips parted slightly as he chewed, but he didn't taste the food. He didn't feel the sharp metallic tang of the soup on his tongue. He was lost somewhere far away. "Jack," Eva whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Jack, we need to go." He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. The waitress appeared at their table again, her movements as fluid as before, too graceful, too calculated. She didn't make a sound as she approached. It was as if she were part of the shadows, blending in with the very fabric of the diner. Her smile was soft, but it had an edge to it now, a cruel, knowing edge that made Ava's skin crawl. "Is everything to your liking?" she asked, her voice low and almost sweet. Laura recoiled, her eyes darting to the waitress, then to the man in the corner. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking now, her tone urgent. "There's something wrong here. I can't explain it, but it's—" Before she could finish, the waitress cut her off. "You can't leave," she said, her voice a whisper now, almost coaxing, like a lover's secret. "Not yet." Ava's heart slammed against her chest as she looked up at the woman. Her eyes were hollow, empty and black, like the depths of a void. Her smile twisted into something more monstrous, more predatory. "You've already made your choice," the waitress continued, her words slow and deliberate, each one like a caress of the cold wind on Ava's skin. "You're part of this now. You belong to the diner." Jack's eyes snapped up then, meeting Ava's gaze. His pupils were dilated, his face pale and drawn, his features slack with an unnatural emptiness. "What's wrong with you two?" he murmured, his voice distant, lost. "It's just a diner." It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them. The tone was wrong. It was as if Jack wasn't speaking for himself anymore, as if someone or something else was using his body to communicate. Eva's stomach churned, her thoughts racing. "What did you do to him?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. The waitress didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head, almost like she was considering Eva. "Nothing yet," she finally said, her voice dark, almost a purr. "But it's already too late. You're here, and there's no going back." Laura was shaking now, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't want to stay. Please, we have to go." But the waitress just smiled again, that cold, knowing smile. "You can't leave," she repeated, her voice growing softer, more insistent. "Not yet." The lights above them flickered, and for a brief moment, the diner seemed to pulse. The sound of distant whispers filled the room, so faint at first it might have been imagined, but then louder, clearer, like the words of 100 voices speaking in unison. "Please," Laura whispered, her voice trembling as she stood up, her hands reaching for the door. "Let us go. We didn't mean to—" A cold gust of air swept through the room, and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Laura stumbled backward, her breath caught in her throat as she turned to face the waitress, whose smile had turned sharp and jagged, her teeth almost too white in the dim light. "Did you really think you could leave?" The waitress's voice was thick with a dark amusement now. "Did you think you could just walk away from this place?" Eva's breath caught in her throat. Her hands were trembling at her sides as she tried to process what was happening. This wasn't a normal diner. This wasn't a place meant for eating or resting. This was a place of something far darker, far more sinister than they had ever imagined. "We are the diner," the waitress continued, her eyes gleaming like black holes. "And the diner is us. We wait, we watch, and we take those who wander too far from the path. Those who are lost." Eva's chest tightened as the words sank in, each one like a weight pressing down on her lungs. She couldn't breathe. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat louder than the last. "The man in the corner," the waitress said softly, her smile widening. "He's waiting for you. You're all waiting for him. Don't worry, dear. He's a patient man." Eva's pulse quickened, her eyes darting toward the corner booth. The man hadn't moved, but there was something about the way he was sitting now. The stillness in him was no longer passive. It was hungry. I don't understand," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you want from us?" The waitress tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "We don't want anything from you. You're already ours. You've been chosen." Suddenly, the room seemed to shift, the air growing thick with an oppressive, suffocating weight. The walls began to pulse, as if they were breathing in time with the rhythm of Eva's terrified heart. The shadows grew longer, reaching out like dark fingers toward them. The diner was no longer just a building. It was alive, its every creaking floorboard, every flickering light, part of the dark heartbeat that enveloped them. Eva couldn't tear her eyes away from the man in the corner. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle now, and though he hadn't moved, she could feel his presence growing, filling the space between them. His eyes, hidden in shadow, seemed to burn through her, digging into her very soul. And then, without warning, he stood. His movements were too smooth, too fluid, as though he weren't truly human, but something else, something ancient, something otherworldly. Laura screamed, stumbling backward as the man took a step forward, his gaze never leaving them. "Let us out," Laura cried, her voice rising in desperation. "Please, let us go!" But the waitress only laughed, a sound that echoed through the walls like the ringing of a bell, a sound that carried with it an undeniable promise. "You can't leave. You're already here." The man took another step forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence like the ticking of a clock. Each step brought him closer, the shadows around him thickening, twisting into shapes that didn't belong in the world of the living. "Jack," Eva whispered urgently, shaking him by the shoulders. "Jack, you have to wake up. This isn't you." But Jack's eyes remained blank, empty, His body, once so familiar, now felt alien, distant. He was no longer Jack. He had been claimed. Eva felt the room closing in on her, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing thicker with each passing second. She looked at Laura, who was backed up against the wall, her hands trembling. And then, the man spoke. His voice was low, a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome to the diner," he said, his words wrapping around them like a vice. "It's time to join the others." Chapter 4. The Cost of Belonging. Eva's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the air around her grow thick, suffocating, as if the very room were closing in on them. And with each passing second, the shadows seemed to grow longer, more distorted. The walls, once familiar, now pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, their surfaces slick and trembling. Like the skin of some ancient slumbering beast that had just begun to stir, she reached out to Jack again, shaking him by the shoulders. His body felt cold, too cold, like it belonged to someone else. His eyes were glazed, distant, as though he were no longer a part of this world, but lost somewhere deep in the void. "Jack! Jack, please!" she whispered, her voice raw with desperation. "Wake up! You have to fight it! This isn't you!" But Jack didn't move. He didn't respond. His face remained blank, his expression a hollow mask. And the man in the corner, his dark eyes never left them. There was no expression on his face. But something in his gaze told Eva that he was waiting, watching, savoring their fear. Laura was still pressed against the wall, her hands trembling as she clutched her chest. Her lips were moving, but Eva couldn't hear her words, only the frantic, desperate rhythm of her breath. The air in the diner had become so thick now that every inhale felt like trying to breathe underwater. It was as if something was choking them, slowly and deliberately, tightening its grip with every passing moment. Why are you doing this to us?" Laura finally gasped, her voice cracking with terror. "What do you want?" The waitress, whose smile had never wavered, stepped forward. Her movements were unnervingly graceful, almost like she was floating rather than walking. "What we want," she repeated, her voice dripping with dark amusement. "What we want is simple, dear. We want you to stay." Eva's blood ran cold. "Stay?" she echoed, incredulous. "Stay here, in this hellhole." The waitress didn't flinch, her smile widening. "This place isn't a hellhole, my dear. It's a sanctuary, a place of refuge, for those who belong. And you will belong. You have no choice." Her voice was like silk, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable truth. The diner is not a place you come to for food or drink. It is a place you come to when you have nowhere else to go, when the world outside has forgotten you. Eva's mind was spinning. No, this isn't real. This can't be real." She turned to Jack again, her voice shaking with desperation. "Jack, please, you have to wake up. We need to get out of here." But Jack didn't stir. His eyes remained glassy, his body unmoving, as though he were already lost to them, as though something had already taken him. Something that was not human. "You're wrong," Laura whispered, backing away from the waitress. "You don't own us. We're not staying here. We won't." The waitress's expression darkened in an instant, her smile disappearing like a shadow at dawn. "You will stay," she said, her voice growing cold and sharp. "All of you will stay, whether you want to or not." The man in the corner stood slowly, his movements so smooth and deliberate that Eva couldn't tear her eyes away. His gaze was fixed on them, his every step sending a ripple through the air. With each movement, the shadows around him seemed to grow longer, curling and twisting, like they were alive, hungry for something. Eva's throat constricted as he took a step closer. "No!" she cried, her voice rising in panic. "We're not staying here. We'll leave. We'll find a way out." "You cannot leave," the man said, his voice low and rasping, like the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. "You've already made your choice. The diner has claimed you. There is no escape." Eva tried to back away, but her legs felt heavy, as though the floor beneath her was shifting, pulling her toward him. She stumbled, gasping for air, as her body seemed to lose all strength. It felt like the diner was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every passing second. The price is already paid, the man continued, his voice hollow, as though it came from somewhere far deeper than his body. You've come too far. You're already part of it. Part of us. Eva's head spun as the words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't comprehend them. Her heart raced, her breath came in shallow gasps, and the walls of the diner seemed to close in around her. The shadows were growing, moving with a life of their own, stretching toward her, curling around her limbs like invisible hands. And then, just as she thought she might suffocate from the pressure, there was a shift, a crackling sound like something breaking. The waitress's face twisted into a grin that was more grotesque than anything Eva had ever seen. Do you feel it now? She asked, her voice full of quiet triumph. The change, the transformation. Eva could feel it. It was subtle at first, a tingling sensation at the edges of her skin, as though something was trying to push its way inside her. She fought against it, trying to hold on to herself, to resist. But the more she struggled, the tighter the grip on her chest became, until she thought she might scream. The air grew colder, her body grew numb. The shadows were no longer just in the corners of the room. They were inside her, crawling beneath her skin, coiling around her spine. Stop it! Stop! Laura screamed, her voice filled with a raw animal terror. She grabbed Eva's arm, her fingers digging into her flesh. Please, we need to get out of here. This isn't real. This can't be real. The man's gaze never wavered. He stepped closer, his eyes locking with Eva's as he whispered, You'll never leave. Not now. Not once you've tasted what we offer. Eva tried to speak, but her throat was tight. Her words strangled in her chest. She felt the weight of the diner pressing down on her, its walls, its floor, its very air, suffocating her, trapping her in its unyielding grip. The shadows were growing, twisting into shapes that no longer resembled anything human. They were like phantoms, horrible, shapeless creatures of the dark. She could feel their presence all around her, breathing down her neck, seeping into her skin. Let her go, Laura cried out, throwing herself at the man, her hands reaching for him, but he didn't flinch. His eyes remained cold, empty, as though nothing could touch him. You're too late, the man said softly. You're already part of us. Eva's vision blurred, and she felt herself falling. The room spun around her, the darkness rising up like a wave to swallow her whole. She fought to keep her senses, to hold on to the remnants of herself that still clung to reality. But it was too much. The pull of the shadows, the pull of the diner was too strong. And then, just as everything seemed to slip away, just as she thought she might be lost forever, she heard a voice, a soft whisper that broke through the darkness like a thread of light. Ava, Ava, don't let go. You're not alone. It was Jack's voice, but Jack was gone, wasn't he? The voice called again, more insistent now, filled with desperation. Ava, you have to fight. Fight, or we'll all be lost. Her head spun, her body numb, but she clung to the voice. She had to. There was no other choice. Chapter 4. The Cost of Belonging. Extended. Eva's breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tight with the weight of the air around her. It felt as though the very walls of the diner were closing in, folding like a living thing, breathing with its own dark heartbeat. The shadows, thick and suffocating, crawled along the floor like creeping tendrils of smoke, and the eerie hum of the diner's strange flickering lights seemed to grow louder with each passing second. She could hear Jack's breathing now, shallow and uneven, but his body remained motionless, like a lifeless shell. His eyes were half-lidded, glazed over, and there was something about his stillness that made Eva's skin crawl. He wasn't asleep, not in the way that people sleep. It was as if his mind had already been taken, swallowed by something much darker, far more sinister than she could comprehend. Jack, please, Eva whispered, reaching out to him again, her hand trembling as she touched his cold skin. Fight it. Fight whatever this is. You can't let it win. But the words felt hollow in the thick, oppressive air. They hung in the space between them like broken promises, useless in the face of whatever force held him in its grip. She felt as though the diner itself was mocking her, mocking them all. The way the shadows shifted and writhed, the way the lights flickered and buzzed, as if they were alive, pulsing with an energy that was not human. Laura's voice, barely a whisper, broke through Ava's thoughts. This place. It's wrong, Ava. We're not supposed to be here. We're not supposed to belong here. Her words were laced with fear, but there was also something else. Something like realization, dawning in the depths of her eyes. We're being claimed. This diner isn't just a place. It's something else. It's pulling us in. Ava's stomach twisted with the force of the truth in Laura's words. The weight of what they had stumbled into, the ancient, unrelenting pull of the diner, settled over her like a dark cloud. It was as if the diner itself were alive, aware of them, feeding off their fear, drawing them deeper into its grasp. The waitress, still smiling with that unnerving, otherworldly grin, stepped forward, her movements graceful and smooth, as though the very air around her bent to her will. Yes, she said, her voice lilting, almost musical. You belong. You came here because the diner called to you. It's not an accident, you see. None of this is. Eva's eyes darted toward the door, the only possible way out. But as she looked, she saw that it was no longer there. The once familiar entryway had disappeared, swallowed by the shadows. All that was left was a hollow emptiness, stretching out endlessly in front of them. There's no way out, Eva, the man in the corner said, his voice low and rasping, yet somehow filled with the certainty of someone who had known this truth for far too long. You can't leave. None of you can. Eva turned toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something wrong with his face, something not human. His eyes were too dark, too deep, like black holes pulling everything into them. His skin was unnaturally pale, and as he stepped forward, Ava could see the faint shimmer of something beneath his skin, something that didn't belong. What do you want from us? Ava demanded, her voice trembling but strong with defiance. We're not staying here. We won't. You will, the man interrupted, his tone flat, without the slightest hint of emotion. You already have. This diner, it doesn't just serve food. It serves souls. The souls of those who wander in, lost and desperate. And once you've tasted its offerings, once you've accepted its invitation, you are bound here. Forever. Eva recoiled, her mind struggling to make sense of the horrifying truth that seemed to pour from his words like poison. The air in the diner grew colder, the shadows thicker, as though the building itself were closing in on them. She felt the chill spread through her limbs, numbing her, making her movements slow and heavy, like she was walking underwater. You don't understand, Laura whispered, her voice hollow. We thought we could leave, but we can't. We're already part of it. We've already been marked. No, Eva whispered desperately, shaking her head. No, we can't be. This isn't real. It's a nightmare. We're dreaming. It's just a dream. But the diner did not respond like a dream. It responded like a living thing, slowly, deliberately, tightening its grip. The floor beneath Eva's feet seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the walls around them creaking and groaning, like the breath of something ancient stirring in its slumber. The man's face twisted, a grim smile spreading across his lips. It's not a dream. It never was. You've come here because you belong. And now, you'll never leave. Not until you pay the price. Price? Laura choked out, her voice cracking with fear. What price? The waitress stepped forward again, her smile never faltering. The price of belonging, she said softly. A soul for a soul, a life for a life. That is how the diner works. And now it's your turn. Eva's heart stopped, the blood draining from her face as the realization hit her like a physical blow. The diner wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a location where they could grab a quick bite or wait for their ride. It was a trap, a place where lost souls were drawn in, never to leave. And once you were in, you were part of it. Jack's body shifted slightly, and Eva's heart leapt in her chest. Had he finally come to? But when she looked down, she saw that his eyes were still vacant, glazed over. He was still trapped, still lost in the depths of whatever dark force controlled the diner. Eva's hands clenched into fists, her mind screaming in protest. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let herself, or Laura, or Jack, fall prey to this hellish place. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break free. But then, the shadows moved. Slowly, like fingers curling around their ankles, pulling at their legs. Eva tried to step back, but the shadows were everywhere now, thick and unrelenting, wrapping themselves around her, dragging her toward the center of the diner. She fought against them, her heart hammering, her breath coming in desperate gasps, but it was no use. The more she struggled, the tighter their grip became. "You see?" the man said, his voice low and mocking. "You can't fight it. You belong here. You always have." A cold wind swept through the diner, and for a moment the room seemed to shimmer. The walls flickered, like the image on a broken television screen. And then there was a sudden crack, sharp and jarring. The air shifted. Everything froze. In that instant, Eva's eyes widened in horror as she realized what was happening. The shadows were not just shadows. They were alive. They were sentient. They were creatures, ancient and hungry, lurking in the very fabric of the diner. And they were now feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every breath she took. The diner wasn't just consuming them. It was feeding on their souls. And the price was their lives. Eva felt her legs weaken, her body collapsing to the floor as the weight of it all threatened to crush her. The last thing she saw before the darkness overwhelmed her was the smile of the waitress, impossibly wide, her eyes glowing with something that wasn't human. They were lost. Chapter 5. The Silent Guests. Eva woke up in darkness. Her head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that matched the pounding in her chest. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from her vision. Her arms were numb, and as she slowly raised them, she realized she was lying on something soft. Too soft. The air around her felt dense, heavy, as if the very atmosphere was pulling her down into the earth. Her heart skipped a beat. The diner, the shadows, Jack, Laura. With a gasp, she sat up, her body jerking as if waking from a terrible dream. The cold, clammy sensation of sweat trickled down her spine as her eyes tried to adjust to the darkness. A faint light flickered above her, casting long, grotesque shadows across the walls. The diner was gone. It was still there in a way, if you could call it that, but it had changed. The walls were distorted, warped in unnatural angles, stretching in every direction. The tables, once familiar and comforting, were now covered in a thick, viscous black liquid that resembled tar, oozing slowly onto the floor. The scent of burnt coffee hung in the air, mingling with a faint metallic tang that made Eva's stomach churn. The oppressive silence around her felt suffocating. There were no sounds of customers, no chatter or clinking of dishes, just the soft drip-drip of something wet hitting the floor. And then she heard it, a faint shuffle, the scrape of shoes against linoleum. It was distant, but unmistakable. "Jack?" Eva's voice cracked as she called his name. The sound felt foreign, as if it didn't belong in this place. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before she heard the shuffle again. Closer now, slower, each movement deliberate and heavy. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned, half expecting to see Jack or Laura, but instead, the shadows shifted. The darkness seemed to bend and twist around her, warping reality, creating silhouettes that didn't belong. Figures, vague and indistinct, appeared in the periphery of her vision. She couldn't see their faces, not at first, but they were there, moving, watching. Eva's pulse quickened, and she scrambled to her feet, ignoring the burning pain in her legs. She spun around, searching for the source of the sound, but the diner was an endless stretch of warped space now, each corner dissolving into blackness. Another shuffle, closer now. "Laura!" Eva's voice was louder this time, her breath quickening. Her heart was racing. She had to find them. She had to get out. The air seemed to close in on her as the figures moved, gliding soundlessly through the fog of shadows. She couldn't make them out fully, but she could feel their presence. It was as though they were standing right behind her, just out of reach, yet so close she could almost hear their breaths. Eva took a step back, her foot catching on something. She tumbled forward, landing hard on the floor, and let out a strangled gasp. It wasn't the floor. Her eyes shot wide open as she realized what had happened. The ground was no longer solid. It was soft, moving, like skin. The diner was alive. Ava scrambled to her feet, horror flooding her senses. The floor beneath her was shifting, the tar-like liquid bubbling as though it were breathing. She tried to run, but every step she took felt like she was sinking deeper into the very essence of the diner itself. Her legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if they were being held back by an invisible force. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence. The figures, those indistinct shadows, were all around her now, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. They didn't speak. They didn't make any noise at all. They just watched. And every time she turned, the shadows seemed to draw closer, closing in on her with an unnatural stillness. She forced herself to move, stumbling through the shifting diner, her eyes darting from one corner to the next. There was no door, no window, no exit. The diner stretched on, an endless void of black and tar, of twisted walls and ceilings that didn't align. The shuffle grew louder, closer, until Ava could feel the breath of the unseen figure against her neck. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but no one was there. Only the oppressive shadows, dark and suffocating, wrapping around her like a net. Then, she saw them. In the distance, standing perfectly still in the center of the diner, were three figures. Tall, thin, their faces obscured by a shadow that seemed to swallow everything in its path. They stood in perfect unison, as if frozen in place. And as Eva stared at them, her breath catching in her throat, she realized something even more horrifying. They were familiar. Her heart skipped as recognition flooded her mind. Jack, Laura, and someone else. The third figure, slightly different from the other two, was a woman. Her body was twisted unnaturally, her limbs too long, her form too angular. Her eyes were wide open, dark pits that seemed to swallow everything in their gaze. And as she stared at Eva, the woman smiled, a sickly, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide across her face. Eva's chest tightened as panic clawed at her insides. The figures were alive, but not in the way she understood. They weren't Jack or Laura. They weren't even human anymore. They were something else, something that had been consumed by the diner, twisted and molded into whatever the diner wanted them to be. The woman's smile grew wider, her head tilting to the side, as if considering Ava like one would a bug caught in a jar. Her voice, when it came, was distorted, like it was being spoken through a broken radio. "Welcome to your new home," she whispered, the words curling around Eva's mind like smoke. "You've finally arrived. We've been waiting for you." Eva backed away, shaking her head in disbelief. No, I'm not staying here. I won't." "Yes, you will," the woman's voice interrupted, low and final. "We all belong here. This is where we end up, where you end up, where you've always been. You are ours now." The ground beneath her feet shifted again, and Ava fell forward, her hands slamming into the floor. It was soft again, like skin, and then it moved. She looked down in horror as tendrils of black tar reached out from the floor, curling around her wrists, her ankles. The liquid was alive. It was alive, and it was pulling her in. Eva screamed, trying to break free, but the more she struggled, the tighter the grip became. She could feel herself sinking, the cold, viscous substance wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into the ground. She tried to push against it, to claw her way out, but it was useless. The diner was consuming her, swallowing her whole, piece by piece. Above her, the woman's voice echoed in the darkness, the last thing Eva heard before the world went black. "Welcome, home." Chapter 6. The Feast of Shadows. When Ava woke again, it was to the distinct feeling of cold fingers running along her spine. The floor beneath her had softened into a spongy mass, as if the diner itself had decided to embrace her in its fleshy grip. She could feel it beneath her, pulsating, alive, as if it was breathing. The air was thick with an ancient smell of decay, like something forgotten in the dark for centuries. She tried to move, to rise, but her limbs were too heavy. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something more, something dark and oppressive that anchored her to the ground. A low hum vibrated through the floor, reaching deep into her bones. Eva's eyes darted around, searching for any signs of movement. But all she saw were the same swirling, oppressive shadows, those twisted, ever-watchful forms lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. Jack, Laura. She needed to find them. She needed to escape. Her heart raced, and she could feel the panic rising inside her, clenching her throat. But no matter how much she strained against the weight pressing down on her, it was futile. She was stuck in this nightmare, and the more she resisted, the deeper she sank into the diner's grip. "Eva," a voice whispered. It was low, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Her breath hitched. The voice, it was familiar. It was Jack. She looked frantically, desperate to see him, to reach him. But the shadows were too thick, shifting like smoke, blocking her view. "Ava!" The voice called again, this time from behind her. But when she turned, there was nothing there. The air felt colder. The diner seemed to stretch and contract around her, warping like an optical illusion. Her skin prickled as the shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching toward her with unseen hands. In the distance, she saw movement. Not just one shadow, but many. Figures walking slowly toward her. Their forms flickered and rippled like heat rising off asphalt, phantoms with no faces, no substance. The diner had swallowed them whole, and they were its prisoners now. They were just like her, lost in the dark maze of its malevolent grip. The figures moved in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic way, and as they came closer, she saw something even more horrifying. They were dragging something behind them, something that left a trail of dark sludge across the floor. Ava's stomach churned, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw what it was. It was a body. One of them, a man or woman she couldn't tell, was limp and lifeless, their face twisted in an expression of agonizing terror. The body was being dragged across the floor as if it had no weight, its limbs hanging at odd angles. The people, if they could even be called that, didn't stop. They just continued moving in their slow, mechanical gait, pulling the corpse with them. Ava felt her chest tighten, and she gasped for breath. But the air was thick with an invisible force, pressing down on her. The shadows crept closer, and she could hear their whispers. Faint, guttural sounds that reverberated in the depths of her mind, clawing their way into her thoughts. "You're like us now," a voice whispered from the corner, a cold, mocking tone in its words. Ava spun toward the sound, but there was nothing there, only shadows. "Trapped. Forever." "Leave me alone," Ava screamed, but her voice cracked, broken and hollow. The words were lost in the vast, empty space that surrounded her. There was no escape, no way out. The bodies drew closer, and she realized, terrifyingly, that they weren't dragging the corpse of some random diner guest. No, it was Jack. The body was Jack's. The shock hit her like a physical blow. No, this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Her legs trembled as she stumbled backward, shaking her head in denial. She wanted to scream again, to call out to him, but the sound of his name died on her lips. The body dragged closer, the lifeless eyes staring up at her, empty, glassy, accusing. Then, the diner spoke. Eva's skin crawled as a deep, growling voice reverberated through the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You think you can leave, but you are already ours." The voice was dark, thick, like a voice from the depths of the earth. It was an ancient presence, timeless and terrible. It had waited for years, decades even, for someone like Eva to wander into its grasp. "You are not the first to come," the voice continued, and Ava's body froze as the floor beneath her began to shake. "And you will not be the last." The walls of the diner closed in, the shadows growing deeper, darker, suffocating. The flickering lights overhead dimmed, casting eerie, stretching shadows that reached out like monstrous hands. Suddenly, she wasn't alone anymore. Out of the darkness, a figure appeared, tall, pale, with an unnerving presence. It moved with unnatural grace, its form barely visible, like a silhouette against the black. Eva could feel its gaze even before it spoke. The figure smiled, an impossibly wide grin that twisted its features into something grotesque. something inhuman. Its eyes, black as pits, shone with malice. It was the thing that had been watching her all along, waiting, just out of her reach. "Welcome to your new home," the figure crooned, its voice sweet but suffused with venom. "You've always belonged here. The diner is hungry, and it feeds on souls like yours." Eva's chest tightened, the air thickening with every word. She couldn't breathe. Her body felt as though it was being pulled into the shadows, each movement heavier than the last. Her limbs were no longer her own. They were stiff, cold, as if the diner itself had taken control. "You will serve the diner now," the figure continued, stepping closer. "You are the feast." The shadows closed in around her, crawling over her skin, seeping into her veins. The tar-like substance began to drip down from the ceiling, its foul smell filling her lungs. It was suffocating her, pulling her into the depths of the diner's heart. And then, the whispers began. Ava's body jerked violently as they surrounded her, suffocating her mind, crawling into her thoughts. The voices were like a chorus, low, seductive, promising release, promising freedom. But it wasn't freedom. It was a trap. "You'll join us," they whispered, voices blending together into a maddening cacophony. "You'll stay forever." The last thing Eva saw before everything went black was the figure's smile, wide and triumphant, before the shadows swallowed her whole. Chapter 7. Echoes of the Forgotten. The air in the diner was thick, suffocating, as if time itself had stilled, frozen in place. Ava's eyes snapped open, her vision blurred, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The shadows still clung to her skin like a second, heavier skin, suffocating her, whispering things she didn't want to hear. She was no longer in the booth where she'd fallen asleep, no longer on the floor where she had collapsed in terror. Now she was somewhere else. The diner had changed. The walls stretched upward, disappearing into an inky blackness, as though the diner's form had expanded, folding into dimensions that no longer adhered to the laws of physics. The floor, too, was not solid. It rippled like the surface of a pool disturbed by unseen hands, waves of darkness spreading out beneath her feet. The lights overhead buzzed with an eerie, mechanical hum, casting flickering pools of light that seemed more like gaping wounds in the fabric of reality than illumination. A cold draft brushed against her face, a faint scent of rot clinging to the air. Eva shuddered, pushing herself up from the damp, clammy ground, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the slick surface beneath her. The shadows had pulled away from her, but they were still present, watching, waiting. In the far corner, where the walls curved away into shadow, a figure appeared. No, not a figure, a presence. It was as if the darkness itself had taken shape, its form shifting like smoke. The moment it stepped forward, the air seemed to warp, distorting, bending around its outline. "Eva." The voice came softly, a familiar whisper, soft, like a caress, yet somehow colder than the chill that gripped her heart. It was a voice she had heard before, in her dreams, in the silences of her mind. "Jack." Her breath caught in her throat. She stared into the darkened corner, her pulse quickening. "Jack?" Her voice came out hoarse, a mere thread, lost in the vast emptiness of the diner. "Eva," it repeated, its tone softer, sweeter, coaxing her like a lullaby. "You've been chosen." The words echoed, reverberating through the cavernous space, spreading like ripples across water. Eva stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs. She reached out, but the shadows recoiled, pulling away as if to mock her desperation. I don't understand," she whispered, feeling her voice crack under the weight of the fear that coiled around her throat like a constricting snake. "What have you done to him? Where is Jack? What is this place?" The dark figure that had once been Jack, its shape indistinct, formless, stepped into the light. The faint glow revealed a grotesque, horrifying silhouette, its body elongated and misshapen. A grotesque parody of the person she had once known. It was Jack's face, yes, but twisted, distorted, as if it had been stretched too thin, pulled out of shape. His eyes were hollow, black pits of despair. "This is not a place for the living," the creature that had once been Jack said. Its voice was no longer comforting. no longer human. It rasped, like something born from the deepest reaches of hell. You should not have come here. Ava's chest tightened with terror. She took another step back, but the shadows moved in response, filling the space between them, closing in. You're wrong, she whispered, shaking her head, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. You're wrong. I'm not like you. I'm not dead. I'm still alive. I can leave. You can't leave, the thing that was Jack interrupted, its voice now like an explosion, cracking the air around them. Not anymore. You belong to this place now, and so does he. Eva's gaze snapped to the darkened figure at her feet. There, lying motionless, was Jack's body, his real body, his face as pale as death, his eyes closed in eternal sleep. But the body was not the same as it had been before. It was deteriorating, rotting even, eaten away by time and something darker still. The skin had become a dull, waxy color, and his fingers were already stiff and bent at unnatural angles. Flies buzzed around the corpse, their wings beating in a maddening rhythm. No, Eva cried, rushing toward him, but the shadows closed in tighter, tightening their grip. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his cold, decaying skin, and in that instant, something inside her, inside the very air she breathed, shifted. It was as though the diner had absorbed all the sorrow, all the pain, and now it was filling her, suffocating her with its despair. Jack's face morphed before her eyes. The decay deepened, his features becoming contorted in agony, his mouth opening in a silent scream, eyes wide in horror, and then his lips moved. I didn't want this, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the shadows. Ava, you have to run, before it takes you too. Eva recoiled, horror flooding her chest. Her hands shook as she pulled away from his body, backing into the center of the room. She could feel the darkness pressing in, suffocating her, consuming her thoughts. The whispers from the shadows were growing louder, more frantic, more insistent. You belong to it now, they whispered in unison, their voices rising like a chant. You belong to the diner, to the endless hunger. Suddenly, the walls around her trembled, the light overhead flickering erratically. The floor beneath her feet cracked, and a deep growl emanated from somewhere below, like the growl of a beast that had been starved for centuries, now ravenous, ready to devour whatever it could find. Eva staggered back, her breath caught in her throat. The air was thick with an unbearable weight, a pressure that felt like it would crush her. The shadows were everywhere now, reaching for her, swallowing the light, pulling her deeper into their embrace. No, she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. I won't stay here. I won't be part of this. The dark figure that had once been Jack moved closer, its form shifting and pulsating, no longer resembling the man she had known, but something far darker. You will stay, it said, its voice now twisted and raw. We all stay. Forever. Eva could feel her body weakening, her limbs growing heavy as though the very air was filled with chains. She struggled, but it was useless. She was trapped. The diner had claimed her. It had taken her. And soon, she would be a part of it too. A part of the unending darkness that consumed everything. With one last desperate gasp, Eva sank to her knees, her mind shattering into 1,000 pieces. She was inside the diner now, trapped in its hunger, its endless, gnawing hunger. And as she collapsed into the void, she could hear the faintest whisper of the diner's voice, low and satisfied, its hunger momentarily appeased. You're just like the rest of us now. Chapter 8. The Hollow Eyes. When Ava opened her eyes, it was as if time itself had shattered into pieces, falling apart around her. The world was a fractured image of what it had been before, jagged, distorted, a mirror cracked by some unseen hand. She was no longer in the diner, or at least not in the way she remembered it. The familiar booths, the tiled floors, the neon lights had all vanished, replaced by a vast expanse of endless darkness. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay, and she could hear the faint dripping sound of water somewhere in the distance, echoing off walls she couldn't see. She rose, her body trembling, Not from cold, but from the deep, gnawing fear that had taken root inside her chest. The emptiness pressed against her skin like a living thing, a presence that lurked just beyond her vision. She turned in a slow, deliberate circle, her heart racing, but there was nothing, only the abyss. It felt as though the darkness itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to falter, to stumble into its embrace. Ava. The voice came from nowhere, and yet everywhere. It was a whisper, soft and insidious, slithering into her mind like a serpent coiling around her thoughts. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't heard that voice in so long. The voice of Jack, but it wasn't the Jack she had known. No, this was something else, something darker, twisted beyond recognition. Jack? Her voice cracked, weak, desperate. Where are you? What is this place? But the response she received was not an answer. Instead, the darkness shifted, rippling like water disturbed by some unseen force. The ground beneath her feet trembled, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, slowly, as though stepping out of a nightmare, its form indistinct and ever-changing. At first, it appeared to be a human shape, but the longer Ava stared, the more it warped, its features shifting like melting wax. It was Jack, or at least, it resembled him. But his eyes were hollow, black pits where there should have been life, staring at her with an emptiness so profound it seemed to suck the very light from the air. Jack, Eva whispered again, taking a tentative step forward, but the figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, staring at her, its gaze unnerving and unblinking. A wave of nausea swept over her, a feeling of suffocating dread that pressed in on all sides. She staggered backward, her eyes never leaving the hollow figure, but it didn't move. It just watched. I don't understand, Eva gasped, clutching her chest as her breath became shallow. Why are you here? What happened to you? The figure's mouth twisted into a semblance of a smile, though it was grotesque, a macabre parody of the smile Jack had once given her. The darkness behind it seemed to pulse, as if alive, and it whispered words she didn't want to hear. You were never meant to leave, it hissed. The voice now a strange mix of Jack's old warmth and something far colder, more sinister. None of us were. Eva's stomach lurched, and she took another step back, but the figure's eyes followed her every movement, its gaze unyielding, unrelenting. Suddenly, she felt it, the pull. The insistent tug of the darkness that surrounded her, trying to pull her toward it, to swallow her whole. The air thickened with an unnatural pressure, and the walls, if they could even be called walls, seemed to close in on her, as though the very space was shrinking, collapsing inward. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible, her legs trembling beneath her. What do you want from me? The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, as if considering her, evaluating her. Ava could feel a dark energy emanating from it, an oppressive force that pressed against her like a physical weight, threatening to crush her. Then it spoke again, its voice now lower, darker. We want what you can give us, it said, its words dripping with malice. We want your fear, your despair, your soul. Eva's heart slammed in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The world was spinning around her, the edges of her vision blurring, but she forced herself to remain still. This was no longer the Jack she had known. Whatever this thing was, it was something else entirely, a creature of darkness, an embodiment of the very thing that had claimed this place and every soul that had ever crossed its threshold. Why me? She managed to choke out. Why am I here? The figure's smile grew wider, its hollow eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. Because you are a part of it now, it whispered, the words like ice cutting through her veins. You always have been. The world shifted again, the darkness swirling around her like a living, breathing thing. The shadows stretched and writhed, seeming to pulse with a life of their own, closing in, enclosing her in their suffocating grip. No! No! She screamed, her voice breaking as she fought against the pull. Her legs felt like lead, her mind spinning in a haze of fear. She had to get away. She had to leave. but there was no escape. The walls, if they were even walls, had disappeared, and all that remained was the crushing void. The figure before her began to grow, its form stretching, becoming impossibly tall, a monstrous presence that loomed over her like a dark god. The very air seemed to warp around it, bending and shifting as if the rules of reality were bending to its will. She felt something cold, sharp, press against her throat, and she realized with a growing sense of terror that it wasn't the figure itself, but the darkness. The shadows had materialized into tendrils, twisting and coiling like serpents, their sharp edges cutting into her skin, leaving cold, burning trails wherever they touched. "Give us what we want, and you will be free," the figure crooned, its voice both sweet and sinister. "Refuse, and you will become one of us." The words echoed in her ears, filling her head with a dizzying chorus of voices, whispers of the dead, voices from beyond the veil. She could feel herself slipping. Her mind, her very soul pulled toward the abyss. "No, I won't," she whispered, though she wasn't sure whether she was speaking to the thing in front of her or to herself. "I won't give you anything. I won't be like them." The figure's grin twisted into something far worse, a grotesque mockery of Jack's once loving smile. "You already are." With that, the shadows surged forward, closing around her like a tidal wave, dragging her into the void. Chapter 8. The Hollow Eyes, Part 2. Eva's breath caught in her throat as the darkness closed in around her like a suffocating vice. She could no longer see her hands or feet, her entire existence swallowed by the cold emptiness that surrounded her. The walls, the twisted, broken remnants of what had once been a place of familiarity, had disintegrated into an impenetrable blackness, and the air felt thick, like she was drowning in it. Her thoughts scattered like loose leaves in the wind. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed whole before it could escape her lips. All that remained was a hollow, gut-wrenching silence, a void where nothing lived and nothing could ever escape. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, like a distant hum, a low murmur carried on the wind. But they grew louder, more distinct, each voice overlapping the other. Familiar voices. Jack's voice was there, but twisted and distorted, no longer a source of comfort, but a maddening mockery. Other voices joined too, voices she didn't recognize, but that felt all too familiar, like echoes from deep within her mind. "Ava! Ava!" They called to her, but the words were not her name. They were an invitation, a beckoning, a command. With a desperate gasp, she tried to move, to fight against the unseen chains that bound her to this accursed place. Her limbs felt heavy, uncooperative, like lead weights attached to her body. Every step was a struggle, every movement a battle against an invisible force that wanted to pull her down into the abyss. And then, in the midst of the chaos, she felt it. The unmistakable sensation of something cold, smooth and wet brushing against her arm. She froze. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sensation. But there was nothing. Nothing visible in the endless void that surrounded her. Yet the feeling was real. Whatever it was there. It's here. The thought struck her like a lightning bolt. She whipped around, her heart pounding, and that's when she saw it. Just beyond the periphery of her vision, a faint, pulsating light glowed, the color of sickly amber, like the last ember of a dying fire. It was weak at first, but it grew stronger, more distinct with every passing moment. Driven by a desperate need to escape, she forced herself toward it, each step feeling like she was walking through molasses. The darkness clung to her skin, to her thoughts, but she pushed forward, determined to find a way out. As she neared the light, she saw something else. A shape. It was humanoid, a figure standing perfectly still in the center of the glowing circle. Ava's stomach churned. There, in the flickering light, she saw the thing that had been haunting her dreams. The twisted version of Jack, his hollow eyes now staring directly at her. "Jack!" she cried out, her voice cracked and frantic. "What is this? What have you become?" The figure didn't move. Its hollow eyes remained fixed on her, and as she reached out to touch it, the figure collapsed into a blur of blackness, vanishing into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. The sudden disappearance of the figure sent a shock of terror through Ava's body. She stumbled backward, her hands shaking, the weight of the void pressing in on her from all sides. "Why are you doing this?" she cried, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" For a long, suffocating moment, there was no answer. Then, the voice returned. The same voice, but this time, it was not just Jack's. It was an amalgamation of voices, layers upon layers of twisted, agonized whispers, filling the air with their discordant symphony. "We want what you owe us," they hissed in unison. "We want what you promised." Ava's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands clutching the uneven surface of the invisible floor, trying to hold herself together. The words rang in her mind like a cruel, mocking refrain. "What I promised." She tried to think, but her mind was clouded, consumed by fear. She had made no promises. There was nothing she had ever agreed to that could explain this nightmare. The diner, Jack, everything. It was all so confusing. But then, a memory bubbled to the surface, distant yet sharp as a shard of glass. The ritual. Her heart stopped. The diner, the people. She had been a part of it all, hadn't she? The promises made. The things they had all done. Jack, the strange customers, the deals they had struck with something far darker than they had realized. She had walked into that place knowing something wasn't right, but the temptation of those strange, elusive moments had clouded her judgment. "Remember," the voices hissed, the word repeating like a mantra. "You promised." The memory surged forward like a flood, breaking through the wall of her confusion. She remembered the strange man who had entered the diner late that night, the one with the crooked smile and eyes too bright to be human. He had offered them something they couldn't resist, and in the haze of their collective desperation, they had agreed. She had agreed. The deal. Eva's breath quickened as the realization settled over her like a heavy weight. The diner had not just been a place of food and drink, it had been a gateway, a bridge between worlds. She had unknowingly crossed into something far more dangerous. And now, she was paying the price. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the darkness around her could smell her fear, feeding off of it, growing stronger. The tendrils of shadow wrapped tighter around her legs, pulling her down into the void. "No!" she gasped, struggling to break free. "No, I won't go with you. I won't be part of this." But the darkness ignored her. It wrapped around her body, pulling her down, suffocating her. Her skin burned where the shadows touched, the coldness of their touch seeping into her bones. The world spun in an unending spiral of terror and hopelessness, and she realized with a sickening certainty that she could not escape. And then, just when she thought she could no longer endure, she heard it again. A voice, clear and distinct above the rest. "Eva," it said, soft but urgent. She turned, her heart leaping in her chest. It wasn't the voice of the shadows. It was Jack. The figure appeared again, but this time it wasn't a hollow, empty shell. Jack stood before her, his eyes not hollow but full of life, full of humanity. He reached out to her, his hand warm and solid, like a lifeline in the storm. "Ava!" he repeated, his voice full of desperation. "Come with me. We can leave this place." For a fleeting moment, hope surged in her chest. This was Jack. The real Jack. He was here. And maybe, just maybe, they could escape together. But even as she reached for him, the shadows clawed at her skin, pulling her back. "No!" she gasped, tears streaming down her face. I can't go back." The figure of Jack hesitated, then stepped forward, his voice now shaking with sorrow. "I never wanted this for you. But you made your choice, Ava. We all made our choice." Eva's heart shattered as the figure of Jack began to dissolve before her eyes. His form melted away, swallowed by the ever-encroaching darkness. And in that moment, she understood. There was no escape. Not for her. Not for any of them. The diner had claimed them all. It was more than just a place. It was a prison, a curse that would never release them. And as the darkness closed in, Ava knew, with terrifying clarity, that her soul would be bound to this cursed place for eternity. Chapter 9. The Shattered Reflection. The diner no longer resembled anything familiar. The walls, once an odd but comforting hodgepodge of vintage decor and artificial warmth, had collapsed into something more primal, a tangle of shifting shadows and crumbling facades. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay, like time itself had been warped and suspended, its passage now irrelevant. Eva could feel it, the oppressive weight of the place. She had been trapped here for what felt like eternity, her mind a battlefield, fighting against the relentless whispers that sought to tear her apart. In the endless expanse of black, her body felt weightless, drifting between reality and some twisted nightmare. And yet, somehow, she could still sense the shape of the diner. Even if she could no longer see it in its entirety, there were moments, flickers of fleeting memories, that made her think she was still inside the very walls she had once known. She stumbled forward, her steps clumsy, as if walking through deep water. The world around her was fractured, splintered like broken glass. Every step echoed, but the sound was muted, absorbed by the vastness of the space. It was almost as if the diner itself had stopped breathing. But Eva still heard the whispers, the voices that had tormented her since she had first set foot in this nightmare. They slithered through the cracks of her consciousness, twisting their words, trying to drag her back into the darkness that waited patiently at the edge of her mind. "You're ours now," they murmured in a chorus of voices, their words seeping into the very fabric of her thoughts. "The diner claimed you. You can't escape. There is no escape." Her pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, she felt the unbearable urge to give in, to surrender to the pull of the voices, to let herself fall into the void they promised. It would be easy, she thought, to simply cease fighting. After all, what was there left to fight for? The life she once knew was a distant memory, fading like an old photograph, its colors lost in the fog of this twisted place. But there was something, someone, that kept her tethered. A memory, a fragment of something warm and human. She could still hear Jack's voice, faint but urgent. "Ava, don't let it consume you." The thought of Jack, of his soft voice, his reassuring touch, sent a surge of strength through her. She could not, would not, give in. She clenched her fists, steeling herself against the overwhelming pressure as the shadows continued their slow, deliberate encroachment. Then she saw it. A faint light flickered in the distance, like the dying glow of a candle. For a moment it felt real, like something tangible in the otherwise crushing void. It was a doorway, or at least the semblance of one. She stumbled towards it, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, clawing at her thoughts, trying to pull her back into the darkness. But she pushed forward, her breath shallow, her mind consumed by a single thought: "I have to escape." The light grew brighter as she approached, casting strange shadows across the shifting, fractured landscape. It was a door, a physical door this time, standing tall in the midst of the darkness, its edges glowing faintly. Eva's breath caught in her throat as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold, weathered wood. She hesitated. The air around her thickened, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. They surrounded her, their voices becoming maddening, incomprehensible, a cacophony of agonized moans and bitter laughter. She pressed her hand against the door, feeling the pulse of energy that radiated from it. There was something strange about this door. It wasn't just a way out. It was a bridge, a liminal space between this world and another. She could sense it in her bones. Without thinking, she yanked the door open. The world beyond was not what she expected. Instead of the world she once knew, there was a reflection of the diner. The same tables, the same booth with its faded red cushions, the same counter where Jack had served customers with his easy smile. But something was wrong. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally, crawling along the floor like the tendrils of something alive. And there, behind the counter, stood Jack, but it was not him. At least, not the Jack she remembered. His eyes were wide and hollow, as if all the life had been drained from them, leaving behind nothing but black, bottomless voids. His face was pale, his skin unnaturally smooth, as though he were a mannequin, a thing made of plastic and not flesh. "Jack," she whispered, stepping forward, her voice trembling. "What happened to you?" But the figure behind the counter did not answer. Instead, it smiled. A smile that stretched impossibly wide, its edges curling in a grotesque parody of happiness. The smile was not comforting, it was monstrous, a rift in the fabric of reality itself. Eva froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Something wasn't right. This was not Jack. This was something else. Something that had taken him and was wearing his skin like a suit. The figure's head tilted to one side, its hollow eyes never leaving hers. Get out, the thought came to her unbidden, a sharp command in her mind. She had to leave. Now. But as she turned to run, she realized the door she had entered through was gone. The hallway she had come from had vanished, leaving her trapped in this impossible reflection of the diner. Jack, please, she whispered, her voice breaking as she fell to her knees. Please, come back. What's happening to you? The figure behind the counter tilted its head again, its smile widening even further. Then, in a voice that was both familiar and alien, it spoke. You don't get to leave, Eva, it rasped, its voice thin and brittle, as if it had not spoken in centuries. You've already made your choice. You're here forever. Eva's blood ran cold. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. The figure's smile began to twitch, the skin around its mouth stretching and cracking, as if it were no longer capable of holding its shape. The figure reached out a hand, long fingers stretching toward her. No, no, no. The words reverberated in her mind, but her body was already moving. She darted to the side, stumbling as she tried to find an escape. But the diner, this twisted reflection of the diner, was not real. It was a dream, a nightmare, and like any nightmare, the more she struggled, the more it contorted around her, trapping her in its suffocating embrace. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the darkness began to close in, the walls shifting again, folding in on themselves, the light dimming until there was nothing but a thick, choking blackness that pressed in from all sides. The figure of Jack, or whatever it was, vanished, replaced by shadows that stretched like fingers reaching for her, pulling her deeper into the void. Ava, the voices whispered, their cruel tones now unmistakable. It's too late. Chapter 10. The final hour. The world was drowning in darkness. It pressed in from all sides, heavy and suffocating, a cold grip around Ava's chest that seemed to constrict with every breath. She could hear the sounds of her heartbeat, erratic and quick, as if her very existence were fighting against the pull of something far more ancient and powerful than she could ever understand. The diner, if it could even still be called that, had transformed into an otherworldly place, a labyrinth of shifting walls, flickering lights, and endless echoes. Nothing was solid. Nothing was real. Eva's hands shook as she ran through the shadows, the sound of her footsteps a hollow echo that seemed to stretch for eternity. Every time she thought she had found an exit, the walls seemed to fold inward, reshaping the diner into something even more nightmarish. The doorways were gone. The hallway she had once passed through had melted into nothing, leaving her with only the oppressive, infinite void. Where is it? She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible against the thick, unnatural silence. She had to escape. She had to. But escape was a lie, a cruel illusion that the diner had played on her. She was trapped in a place that existed outside of time, outside of reason, a place where the boundaries between life and death no longer mattered. Every step she took, every breath she drew, seemed to draw her deeper into the heart of the nightmare. Her mind flickered, and for a moment, she thought she saw Jack again. His face, pale, emotionless, with those black voids for eyes, appeared in the corner of her vision, standing just beyond her reach. He was watching her, not as someone she knew, but as something else. A husk, a shell of the person he once was. You don't belong here, his voice whispered, soft but chilling. You were never meant to leave. Eva's heart froze, the words slicing through her like a shard of glass. She stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the emptiness where Jack had been moments before. Had it been real? Or just another trick of the diner? The thought of him, of the person she had cared about, twisted her insides. How could this place have done this to him? To all of them? But as the darkness closed in, she realized she couldn't linger. There was no time. She had to find a way out. even if it meant confronting the horrifying truth that this place was never meant to let her go. Her eyes darted to the counter, where she had seen Jack, or whatever it was, standing moments before. She felt a pull toward it, a strange compulsion that she couldn't ignore. Against all logic, she began moving toward the counter. The shadows around her seemed to shift, bending and twisting, but she kept her gaze locked ahead, her legs moving of their own accord. As she approached, the air grew colder, and the whispers, those same malicious voices that had taunted her from the very beginning, grew louder. Their words, indecipherable and filled with venom, blurred together into an incoherent mass of hate. "You don't understand, Ava," they hissed. "You never will." The counter, too, was no longer the mundane wooden structure she had once known. It was now a massive, dark shape, an oppressive monolith that loomed over her like a shadowy god. The dim light that flickered above her was the only thing that kept the darkness at bay, casting long, grotesque shadows across the warped form of the diner. The otherworldly version of Jack appeared again, but now he was different. His body was distorted, stretched and bent unnaturally, as if it had been pulled and twisted by some malevolent force. His hands, once warm and familiar, were now claws, sharp and inhuman. His mouth opened wide, too wide, showing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "You're too late, Ava," he croaked, his voice now deep and guttural, like the growl of some monstrous creature. "This place has claimed you, and you will never leave." Eva's throat tightened, her eyes wide with terror. She stepped back, trying to breathe, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense anymore. The diner had become a reflection of her darkest fears, her greatest regrets, a place where time bent and twisted in ways that were impossible to understand. And now, she was at its mercy. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real." The figure of Jack stretched its clawed hand toward her, the air around it warping, pulling in on itself as if the very fabric of reality was coming undone. The walls of the diner quivered, their edges blurring and shifting, as if they too were alive, hungry for something more. "You never left, Eva," Jack said, his voice distorted, echoing across the empty space. "You were never meant to. This place feeds on you. It feeds on your memories, your regrets. You can never escape it." Eva took a step back, her mind racing. She couldn't let this be the end. She refused to be another lost soul, trapped in this endless nightmare. She didn't know how, but she had to break free. Suddenly, there was a sound, a faint rumble that seemed to come from deep within the walls of the diner. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as if something massive was awakening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned her gaze to the source of the noise, and then she saw it. In the far corner of the diner, a shadow loomed. It was massive, its shape distorted and swirling in a way that made her eyes hurt to look at it. The shadows that surrounded it seemed to bend toward it, as though they were part of its form, merging with it. There was something ancient, something impossibly old, embedded in its form. The darkness itself seemed to writhe and pulse, like it was alive. "Ava," the voice of Jack whispered again, but it was no longer his. It was the voice of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. "The diner is yours now. It's always been." Eva's legs moved on their own as she ran, desperate, terrified. She couldn't look back, but she could feel the weight of the presence behind her. She could feel the eyes of the diner watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move, to slip, to surrender. Her body was aching, her mind was frayed, but she pressed on. She reached the far wall where the familiar door, the one she had entered through before, appeared, though it was warped and trembling like a reflection in broken glass. Without thinking, she lunged for it. Her hand touched the cold, familiar handle, and for a moment, she could feel a flicker of hope. This was it. This was the way out. She had to believe it. But then, as she turned the handle, the door buckled and warped in her grasp. The shadows reached forward, grabbing at her with unseen hands, pulling her back into the void. The door shattered, its pieces scattering in every direction as she screamed, her voice swallowed by the encroaching darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the door was gone. The diner had claimed her. Epilogue. The unseen truth. The diner stood silent once more, its warped and twisted silhouette looming against a backdrop of eternal darkness. The flickering neon sign outside buzzed faintly, casting an eerie red glow upon the cracked pavement. No one would ever pass through its doors again. No curious traveler, no lost soul in search of answers. Its entrance, once so welcoming, had long since vanished, swallowed whole by the shadows it birthed. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and decaying memories hung in the air, mingling with the faint whispers of voices long silenced. The walls, once so familiar and full of life, now seemed to breathe with an unnatural pulse. It was no longer a place that existed in time, but a space outside of it, caught in a loop of sorrow, regret, and forgotten souls. Eva's face, her once vibrant eyes now hollow and cold, stared out from the cracked mirror behind the counter, her reflection distorted and broken. She was no longer the woman who had walked in so naively all those years ago. She had become part of the diner, its essence now fused with hers. There was no escaping what she had become, an eternal resident in a place that thrived on the souls it consumed. She had learned the truth too late. The diner wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a place where people came and went. It was a hungry entity, feeding on memories, desires, regrets, the very things that kept its victims tied to it, tethered to a world that no longer had any place for them. Those who entered, who sought to escape, would find themselves trapped, twisted into something unrecognizable, lost to the walls that held them captive. And so, the diner waited. It waited for the next unsuspecting soul to walk through its doors, for the next victim to feel the pull of its twisted, ghostly charm. It waited for those who believed they could escape their past, for those who were foolish enough to think they could outrun the darkness within themselves. The diner was always hungry, and it would never be satisfied.